And then, as a rule, with the recordings, I just find a place to start, clip off the front and back ends, just
Yep.
go kind of a rolling start. Um, so I've got all these notes. I've done all this preparation, trying to
Oh
get my
my.
ducks in order, which has me thoroughly confused at this point. Oh, let's start with the history. And then I know a lot of people want to know about your time in the Dominican Republic. Um, and I guess I'm interested in also addressing how the nature of pastoral work has changed over the many decades,
Yeah.
century and 3/4 almost of the
Yeah.
CRC. So, but in your in your memory, you remember your grandfather.
Yep.
How old were you when he passed? You were in seminary or college?
My grandfather passed. I should have brought up some genealogies.
No, don't worry about it. I was thinking, I think I read about it in
I
your
was
dad's book.
yeah, I was in seminary. Yeah, I believe that's right. Let me think. I was in the Dominican Republic because we took a picture with my oldest son with my grandfather after he had suffered a stroke. So that was,
Okay.
I'm pretty sure my grandfather passed in 91. And so I had already done an internship in the Dominican Republic and we were back for ordination. And because my son was born during my internship in the Dominican Republic.
Okay. I think in the book, Chains of Grace by
Yep.
Hiram Vander Klay.
Stan.
Oh, Stan. Hiram
Hiram's
is
my
your
grandfather.
Sorry about that, Stan. Um, uh, it must have been your grandfather on your mother's side.
Yeah, he died when I was in college. I remember that.
Okay.
So he was the first of my grandparents to die.
Okay. And now on your father's side, that's the pastoral lineage.
Yeah, on my father's side, yeah.
And your grandfather.
My mother's father worked in he worked in a machine shop in Whitensville, Massachusetts.
Okay.
There's all that Whitensville. The Dutch immigrants came there because Whitensville was a industry town, and Mr. Whiten sort of ran the town. He owned the town and everything, and he was a very benevolent town owner, and so he tried to provide for his workers well. And so they had a cow influenza that cleared out all of the dairy cows in that area, and so they went to Friesland in the Netherlands to get new cows. And they got the workers for the cows too. And that's how all the Frisians came to Whitensville and how the Whitensville Christian Reformed Church got going.
Now, your mother is of a different Dutch lineage, though.
Right. My mother is Frisian. And the Frisians were a tribal group that was over the north of the Netherlands and northwest of Germany. And so they were sort of divided between those two areas. The Frisians are a pretty ancient people. They're ethnically distinct from the Dutch. They have their own language, their own culture, and they're probably older than the Dutch. But they're also have a reputation. You can ask John Van Donk. He'll say nasty things about the Frisians. We had a meetup in the Netherlands where we had a big circle of about 50 people, like one of our first big meetups in the Netherlands. And of course, I'm there with Van Donk, who's speaking Dutch, so I don't understand what he's saying. Then he says something nasty against the Frisians. You could just see in the group who are Frisians. And I said, Van Donk, we're just starting this thing and you insult a third of the people here in this. It's Van Donk. I don't know what he said, but it wasn't nice.
These old rivalries. Now with this going way back to the war that resulted in in Dutch independence from Spain, the Frisians remained Catholic. Is that correct?
I have no idea.
Okay.
I have no
Maybe I
idea.
did too much
Today,
deep diving.
not. The
But today not.
Frisians.
Today they're Reformed.
There's significant Roman Catholic population in the Netherlands. The Reformed and the Catholic still are two of the biggest religious groups there, to the degree that the Dutch are religious. But yeah, so I don't know that that was a Protestant Catholic split. The Protestantism was a big part of Dutch independence, though. I mean, the Belgic Confession, which is one of our 3 doctrinal standards in the Christian Reformed Church, was written during that war by someone who, it was so the separatist movement definitely had a religious component.
Right. Well, and then how did you to your personal family story? When did you discover the Jewish lineage, and have you been able to date it precisely when it switched from
Well,
or
it was
integrated?
about 2 years before my father died. My father died in 2013, so it was about 2011. And my father's cousin, Pearl Ann, had a son who was good friends with a professional genealogist. And so he did a genealogical background of his friend and then my father's cousin. And this is where we had always known, we had known for a long time about the Jewish ancestry, but we didn't know the extent of it. Because during the Second World War, my grandfather said to my father, if we were in the Netherlands, we might be in trouble. That's interesting. Well, what? Why? Because they discovered about the Holocaust, but we didn't know the extent of it. And then with the genealogy, it was pretty aptly demonstrated that they went all the way back to the 17th century, before Napoleon, before the Dutch surnames, and we were Jews. And then we discovered that in the Netherlands, Vander Klay was a fairly common surname that the Jews took for themselves, because at some point they had to take surnames. And even in going back far enough, even within one of the nuclear families going back far enough, one of the sons decided to be a Vandenberg and the other decided to be Vander Klay. And so I'm from the Vander Klay line. And then we saw that all of these Dutchmen, all of these Vander Klays were died in the Holocaust. And so when I went to the Netherlands for the first time with Van Donk and Job, they were kind enough to sort of drive me up there to the north where my family had been from. And then it was because we had found this one monument in this one Oppingendam that was just full of Vander Klays. And then there was a Jewish cemetery, which we couldn't get into. And so then it sort of added to the question for me, well, what happened? Because it was clear then, I did a little bit more digging. My mother was playing around with genealogies, that my great-great-grandfather sent my great-grandfather to the United States to intentionally sort of set up shop. So the first one had to go through Ellis Island. And then once he would be sort of settled someplace, he could emigrate the rest of the family into where he was so they wouldn't have to go through Ellis Island. So at the age of 18, 19, my great-grandfather took a boat out of Rotterdam across, went to Ellis Island, ran that gauntlet. And it was a smart choice because he's a young, healthy, no diseases, could be a good worker. So he qualifies to get into the country. He goes to West Michigan, Spring Lake, Michigan, and then the rest of the family comes in. But only that nuclear family came in. So it's quite clear that my great-great-grandfather was in some ways alienated from the rest of the family. And I believe, if I recall correctly, my great-great-grandfather was the youngest of his siblings. And it could have been that he married a Dutch girl or he just didn't want to relate with the Jewish community. I have no idea why, but he clearly left and he clearly went to Western Michigan. And when they went to Western Michigan, they started attending the Reformed Church in America in Spring Lake, not the Christian Reformed Church, which was interesting. And so I've got pictures of, these family gatherings. They also, one of Saka, that's my great grandfather, his brother, Andrew, his older brother, Andrew, was, looking back on it, was disabled. He always lived with his parents. And then once his parents were dead, a sister. And he never worked a regular job. In the census report, he was always a laborer. And so it's quite clear that he was in some way disabled, could be mentally disabled in some way, just simple perhaps. And so he always lived with family. Saka was the other boy of the family, and the rest were daughters. And then the daughters married Dutch Americans. And my great-grandfather married after he got to Western Michigan, but she died in childbirth with their sixth child. The midwife botched it and she bled out after giving birth to her daughter. So then my great-grandfather is in Spring Lake and he's got 6 small children, and he's going to have to do something to get them taken care of. And actually his wife who passed away, her brother had been married and had a daughter with a different woman, and her brother had died, leaving his wife alone with a little girl. And then my great-grandfather moved to Grand Rapids with his 6 children, and what would be his sister-in-law moved in to help take care of the family at first because the kids didn't get along. Her parents were raising her daughter, but she lived with my great-grandfather to help with the 6 kids, and then they married. And that then became the grandmother that my father knew. And I have a picture of her. She lived to over 100, her and my father and me all in a picture. And her picture was in the banner when she got to be over 100 because the Christian Reformed Church was that way. But that's why my grandfather grew up in Grand Rapids and met my grandmother in Grand Rapids. And my grandfather then went on from 8th grade. Everybody got an 8th grade education back in the day. Went on from 8th grade, went to what was the Calvin Prep School for seminary education, and eventually got his degree to be a Christian Reformed minister.
Now he was ordained in 1932 or 33, something like that.
Yep. And there's a really fun, I don't have it up anymore, but I should find it. There's a really fun travelogue. He and 3 other seminarians took off in a car and traveled all the way to the west coast of the United States, all the way from Mount Baker up in northern Washington down to Redlands, and did a huge loop as a seminary quartet. And they would stop in these churches and they would sing and they'd take a little offering and then they'd go to the next one. And he had a little camera and he took snapshots and he kept a diary. It's a great, great piece of memorabilia. And my father, who could read my grandfather's writing a little better, we still have all this. He then wrote it all out. And for a while I had it published on my leadingchurch.com blog. And it's a great story of these 4 seminarians, all single. You weren't, even up until the 50s at Calvin Seminary, you weren't allowed to marry, which was interesting because the pastor who was here before me, a few before me, Earl Marlink, who I got to know quite well, he married his wife secretly, Lenore. And and then the seminary found out, but what are they going to do about it? You can't, have them divorce. And so, but my father and my mother married right after seminary. My father finished Calvin Seminary in 1960 and my mother in Calvin College in 57. And so they married that summer and then went to their first charge, which was Paterson, New Jersey. He had 2 calls, job offers as they'd be called today. One was to a dual church like basically 2 small churches in northern Alberta. And I thought, well, it wouldn't have been funny if I'd grown up in northern Alberta. But because my mother's family was from Massachusetts, and my father's family at that point were on Long Island in a Christian Reformed church, just family things, it was just much nicer to be in Patterson.
Now, how do you compare do you have any understanding or memory of what your grandfather's ministry was like compared to your father's? Because your father's a unique character who we're going to have to dig into.
My grandfather was, there's a great story about my grandfather. The last church that he took, which was in Vergennes, Vermont. Back in those days, the way you would find a Christian Reformed minister, if you were a Christian Reformed church, was you would look through the yearbook at ministers, and if they had been someplace 4 or 5, 6 years, it was like, they'll be free for a call. And so sight unseen, you would send a letter to call them. And so my grandfather received a call to the Vergennes church in Vermont. He had been in the Long Island church, and he accepted the call, but they had never heard him preach. They had never done anything, which is amazing because he could have driven. This is the 19, shoot, I haven't looked it up. 60s or 70s, I don't know. So they call him. I heard this story from Peter Borgdorf, who was a very important person in Christian Reformed history. I heard this story after the executive director search team had a little party after Steve Timmermans was ratified by Synod. And Peter Borgdorf kind of took me aside and said, I want to tell you a story about your grandfather. Apparently, the Vergennes church called my grandfather, and so he went up there to preach. And it was so bad. The elders, this is a minister who's been a minister all of his life. It was so bad. The elders of the Vergennes church called the pastor at Pleasant Street, which is the church my mother goes to, was kind of the largest church in the region, and said, we want you to, they probably were the calling church for the Vergennes church. We want you to let Reverend Vander Klay know that we're rescinding the call. And the pastor, Peter Borgdorf, was like doing an internship or something there. So the pastor basically gives it to Peter Borgdorf to be the messenger of this bad news to this minister who's just 4 years away from retirement. And apparently my mother has no knowledge of this. My father died before I'd heard this story, but Peter Borgdorf told me the story because he remembers going down to my parents' house in Patterson and sitting with my grandfather on the front porch of the house and basically telling him the Vergennes church has decided to rescind the call. And my grandfather telling Peter Borgdorf, I'll take that into consideration. And he completely ignores it. They move into the parsonage. He starts preaching, which is just a ballsy move because the elders, they're the ones who are going to pay you. And, if they really wanted to stop him, they could have not let him into the parsonage. But it's all this. And, they grew to love him because my grandfather at family meals, when my father, it's kind of the custom, we're all together with my grandparents are there. And my father would say something like, Dad, would you open the meal in prayer? Sure. My grandfather would start to pray, and it would be a long prayer. And my grandmother was not a very patient woman. So you could hear her over there sighing about how long the prayer was and how the food was getting cold. But there he would go praying this long prayer. And the key to my grandfather was he loved people really well. And I still today will run into people older than myself who were his parishioners, maybe as children, and they loved him. I will run into people who will say, your grandfather was my favorite pastor. And I know it wasn't because he preached good sermons, because clearly Vergennes didn't think so. And I know he prayed long and all of these things, but he really knew how to care for people. And my father didn't go to Canada with my grandfather. My grandfather took a call to Owen Sound, Ontario. And this was at the time when the Dutch were leaving the Netherlands after the Second World War because they were starving, basically. And Phlebas actually talked about this recently in a live stream. The stories of the Canadians when they went to the Dutch when they went to Canada, those stories are horrendous often because they were basically refugees. They were split up. They were treated like cattle, just really poorly treated by the Canadians. And my grandmother and my aunt, two, in my living memory, had nothing good to say about Canada or Canadians. And the CRC people considered themselves, sort of separate. But my aunt went to the public school in Canada, and she was just treated so poorly by those Canadian students because she was treated as the Dutch were treated. They assumed that she knew nothing. She couldn't speak the language because she was Dutch. I mean, it's so funny because we have all of these ideas about racism tied to like skin color and things. Mm-hmm. People are very subtle. And so many of the Canadians treated my aunt horrendously. And so my aunt did not like it. But my grandfather stayed in that church longer than any of the other churches he stayed in. Partly because he went there because in the Christian Reformed Church, it was known that these were refugees coming over and they needed help. And so my aunt and my uncle have a lot of stories. My father had already headed off to college at that point. But my aunt and my uncle have a lot of stories of my grandfather. Some Dutch family would come in, or Dutch individual would come in on the train station. The guy at the train station would call my grandfather. My grandfather would go pick him up. Everybody had to move beds so the person or the family could have a room, and they would stay with my grandfather and grandmother until they could find their placement or their sponsor, or however they got to Owen Sound. And also there are stories about that church. My grandfather was fluent because he was raised in America. He was fluent in English, but he was also fluent in Frisian, and he was also fluent in Dutch. And my grandmother had hosts of stories. My grandfather probably never would have told these stories, but my grandmother lived another 10 years longer. Hosts of stories of all kinds of the craziest machinations in churches. Just all kinds of horrible church stories. And one of them was because my grandfather preached in Dutch at that immigrant church, a lot of the Frisians assumed he didn't know Frisian because his Dutch was so good. And he was considered American because his English was so good. So why would he know Frisian? But he knew perfect Frisian because that was the area of the Netherlands they left. So he's walking through, everybody's chit-chatting after church out there. And the Frisians are in their own little cluster speaking Frisian with each other. And they're bad-mouthing him, probably talking about how horrible his sermons were. He just steps into their circle in perfect Frisian and tells something to them. They just all freeze because they'd all been bad-mouthing him in Frisian. And suddenly they learn he's known everything that they're saying about him, but he didn't hold it against them. He continued to love them and be their pastor. And you know what? Today, when we look back at my grandmother, had a lot of bitterness about the way that the people coming into Canada treated each other. And that would just make my grandmother sick because my grandmother looked at them all like they're all poor souls. They come here with nothing. They're trying to survive and they turn on each other. But today we would look at it and say, these people just left, how many years of Nazi occupation and then starvation? They're just dripping with trauma. They all are. And a friend of mine, Pete Vanderbeek, who's been around the channel a little bit, he's written a little bit about that first generation coming back from the Netherlands to Canada. They were just sort of like traumatized people who decided we are going to thrive. We are going to sacrifice everything. We're going to build our churches. We're going to build our schools. We are going to climb the ladder. And that generation did. What they sacrificed and built was truly impressive. Now, then you always have the interesting generational transition when the children and the grandchildren of that generation, well, they've all been raised in affluence now. And so you get all of that. But my grandfather was a saint. He wasn't a great preacher, but I remember as a college kid, the last trip that my grandparents took driving from Grand Rapids, where they lived, to Patterson to visit my parents. My sister and I rode with them as sort of help with the driving, but also they were kind of getting iffy in their old age with a 14-hour trip like that. And so my parents were like, go with Grandpa and Grandma. And, I was at that point, I was, maybe 20 and my sister was 18 or 19, something like that. And I sat, because they were old school people. So I sat in the front seat with Grandpa, and the two of us would drive. And Grandma and my sister would sit in the back seat. It sort of galled my sister because, of course, you've got the old school gender differences. And so it's a 14-hour drive. So, I'm a great nap taker. I like taking naps. And so I'd be up there taking a nap, and my grandmother's just talking the whole 14 hours in the backseat. Talk, driving my sister crazy. And then I'm falling asleep up there, and my grandfather dares to say something, and my grandmother jumps on him. Hi, he's trying to sleep. Why don't you let him sleep? And my sister's sitting there like, I want to sleep, and I'm captive to you in the back seat, and I can't do anything. And I just remember that trip. My grandmother, she was an amazing woman. She was a writer. She wrote for the Banner. She had a column. She wrote Bible puzzle books. Brilliant woman, but not a lot of patience, very sharp tongue. She'd be in the backseat talking nonstop the whole 14 hours. Hi, Hiram was his name. Hi, I'm a little warm. Lean over, just adjust the air conditioning. Well, now I'm a little cool. I watched that man for 14 hours, adjusting that darn air conditioner. And of course, I would have been, well, why don't you sit in the front seat and suit it, tune it to your liking. Never complained a bit. To his dying day, I remember visiting him in the old folks' home. He'd always be wearing a tie. His daughter would be like, why don't we get you a polo shirt so you don't have to wear a tie? Mom likes me in a tie. So every day he'd get up and dress up to sit there in a tie because his wife liked him in a tie. And she had no patience. So then when his mind was going, he would sometimes leave socks around their little 2-bedroom apartment. Drove her crazy. I'd go there as a college student. He's just leaving his socks here. She's just complaining about the man. Didn't hold it against her once, and that was him. He was a saint. My uncle, the youngest of the 3 kids, he has some great stories because my uncle was of another different generation, and he could try my grandfather's patience. And he told me a story once. I'd never seen my grandfather get angry or lose his patience, but he said, there was one day when I was just cutting up and doing stuff, and I thought, yeah, that old man can't run. He said, when he lost his temper, that was it. But it hardly ever happened. But when it happened, it happened. And my father, in many ways, had a similar temperament to my grandfather, in that my father, very seldom angry. There's only 1 or 2 times in 18 years of growing up when I remember him losing his temper. Very even keeled, very forgiving. And I'm far less so than either of them, even though I know some people think I'm that way. I'm less agreeable than my grandfather and my father. I've got more of my mother in me because she was less agreeable too.
So would you call Hiram an institutional man?
Everyone then was.
Okay.
It seemed everyone was about.
Well, were they? Because I'm thinking in the 1920s. In the 1920s, you have this kerfuffle that between first Jansen and then Hoeksema.
they were principled, but the institution was strong, I think partly because everyone understood that their individual destinies would rise or fall with that institution. I mean, in many ways, the Christian Reformed Church was sort of a sect in that, if you pressed them, they wouldn't say that only Christian Reformed Church members are going to heaven. But, they really sort of thought that of all of the people on the earth, maybe some of the groups in the Netherlands and us certainly have it right. Almost, everyone else is a little bit or a lot wrong. It's just the way it was among them then.
So maybe he was a man that was oriented towards trying to keep the peace after, and that is a maintainer of the institution.
Yeah.
That's kind of his role, but beyond the obvious day-to-day tasks of just on the ground pastoring, which was demanding in and of itself in the Depression and then World War II and after World War II. And
Pastoring was a full-time affair. You could be called anytime, day or night. In America, my father grew up regularly seeing my grandmother serving food to hobos because they would make their way on the train. And then my grandparents couldn't figure out, how do they always find us? And then one day they noticed there was a phone pole in front of their house and there was a mark on it.
yeah,
And then they went down and they noticed that basically the hobos sort of marked out their house as, this is a place you could get a meal.
Yeah.
And so, my father remembers one person that they had in there. And then, during the war, sugar was rationed, and the Dutch love their sugar and they love their coffee. And so, of course, they had this hobo in there and they had the sugar thing and they're just loading the sugar into my grandmother's just watching. But, it wasn't a woman's place to say anything, but my father just knew inside she was. Of course, my grandfather would be completely the opposite.
right. So, did he even have time for denominational politics? Was he interested in that? Did he avoid it? Did he participate in it? Did he just
Given
figure?
the fact that he was never, see, it was my grandmother that wrote in the banner.
Okay.
So my grandfather would have been much more oriented to people and the local. He did go to synod. There was one point where it was in the midst of the civil rights movement and all of the turmoil in America, and my father was a liberal in some ways because he's pastoring this church in Patterson. And so somebody of the previous generation at synod says to my father, "What happened to you? Your father was such a good conservative." And he was. But the main thing about my grandfather was he cared for people. And that was the work that he did. He cared for people. And so when this woman who grew up in his church in Iowa says to me, "Your father was my favorite minister," I know exactly why, because he had a bright smile. He loved people and he knew how to care for them. And so at the Virgins church that wanted to rescind the call, he finally retired out of that church. They loved him, and they loved him because he loved them.
Just for reference, Virgins. I don't know if you even mentioned what state. Where's that at?
Vermont.
Okay, thank you.
So Christian Reformed people, the dream of, so what happens in the Netherlands during the afscheiding is it's a very skewed split. And it's the rural poor who sort of go with the Koch and the afscheiding, and it's the city people who stay with the state church. And when the emigration waves of the late 19th century happen in the Netherlands, as is usually the case, it's the poor and the people who don't have a lot of opportunity. They leave the Netherlands, and all of these people are, they're basically farmers and dairymen, And so it's the dream of every Dutchman to have your own dairy. And so what the Dutchmen do all over America is it's like, can we get land cheap? Can we raise a cow? Can we make a go of it? And so the history of the Christian Reformed Church is these deep colonies that usually were sort of the initial landing places for the immigrants, but then they start looking around, and there's places where the Dutch thrived, but there's a lot of places and stories where they didn't, and where you just, everybody just imagined all that land is going to be good, but not every place is the bottom land of the Rhine Valley, which is the Netherlands. You go to Nebraska, it's a completely different thing. So you have all these communities that thrived, usually starting with dairy, and then the younger sons would grow up and get education and do all of those things. And then you had all these would-be colonies that collapsed. And Virgins didn't collapse, but they didn't thrive.
Okay. Maybe because the cows are working too hard to stay warm. I don't know.
Could be. Same or other factors like the Long Island Church. A lot of those sort of hinterland communities were very conservative. And so when, for example, the Women in Church office thing came through in the 90s, the CRC shed a lot of those kinds of communities.
Mm.
But the urban communities, much more stayed with women in office.
You used the word offskiting. Maybe educate people on what that means.
That was there were a bunch of these issues were all about control. Could a local church determine who would be minister of that local church, who would be baptized in that church? Should the church council decide? Should the local church council really decide? And so the offskiting was basically about that. The state church was being a little bit dictatorial, and Henrik de Kock basically, decided, I'm not going to deal with it. And so they jailed him, and for not, bowing to the direction of the state church coming from Amsterdam or wherever the home office with The Hague. And but at some point they're like, why are we fighting these poor people? Just let them do their church thing, because nobody cared about them. They're just these poor people up in the hinterland farms. And that's where, so part of the reason that the latest same-sex marriage wars is different in the Reformed Church in America and the Christian Reformed Church is because the Christian Reformed Church's DNA comes from that offskiting, where it's decentralized. So now when a Christian Reformed church like the Palo Alto Church at our classis meeting just left the denomination, when the Christian Reformed Church wants to leave, they just basically go through a process and they leave with their building. As long as a majority of the people want to leave, you've paid for the building. We hate to see you leave, but unlike a lot of mainline denominations where, there's a lot of sad stories where local churches want to leave and then they got to pay for their building twice.
Right. Was that figured out before the latest controversy in the CRC, that mechanism for it, or was that negotiated with the in the last couple synods?
A lot of that had happened already in the 1990s over women in church office. That was a much larger split than this one. So 50, 60,000 people left the denomination then, over 100 churches. So the template was sort of set with the departure to the right over women in church office. And so the machinery was pretty much in place by this split. So
those Dutch immigrants that came over on the heels of the offskiting, it was, so people know, there was like a little revival that took place. It began in the seminaries in Geneva and exploded. It's in French, it's called Reveil. How do you pronounce it in the Dutch? Do you pronounce the L?
I have no idea.
Okay, we just
But
call let's just call it a revival, a
but you're
Calvinist
exactly right,
revival.
and this was part of, so we get this class in CRC church history and seminary, and the reveal, that's what we called it, was a
Okay.
big piece of that revival that goes through of pietism.
Yeah, it's really interesting. Now, while you have what's called the Second Great Awakening in the United States, this is happening in Europe right on the heels of once they got shed of Napoleon, religion could breathe again,
Yep, yep.
and it took off, and it manifested. It's really interesting. Dutch Calvinism seems to have an ebb and flow, there's a tension between a loosening liberalization period and then a conservative reaction. And you've recycled this multiple times in your history.
Yep.
And now I've not gone back in my research to before Napoleon, but this post-Napoleonic era was a conservative reaction to the state church, which was considered, I don't know what kind of language they would have used at the time, but we would call it secularization or modern scientific. This was before the German critics really.
Well, the anti-revolutionary party in the Netherlands, Abram
Okay,
Kuyper was involved in that. And so there's this big movement against the French Revolution. And so when Job talked to me recently and he talked about finding Herman Bavinck, that whole reaction is against the French Revolution.
okay, and so would you say they're rebuilding the Dutch church coming out of the revolution and Napoleon?
Well, Abram Kuyper and Herman Bavinck, I mean, they're almost a century later than the French Revolution.
Right.
Um, they
both die in the early 1920s, right?
yeah, and they both went to liberal seminaries. So not only do you have sort of this liberal conservative TikTok, you also have the urban rural dynamic going, which was a big part of the Aufskyting.
Right.
And the liberal cities versus the rural countryside. And in some ways, that is continuing to be what's going on in the Christian Reformed Church even today. But Bavinck and Kuyper both were trained in, at that point, post-Darwin liberalism. And Abram Kuyper, for one, he gets, trained in a liberal seminary. If I remember correctly, his father's also a minister, but he's not terribly impressed by his father. Kuyper clearly wants to be an intellectual, but then he goes to his starter church, which is usually what you do. You go out of seminary and you got to pay your dues as a minister first before they give you, the high status positions. And he goes and there's a woman in his congregation. There's a little group in his congregation that aren't particularly impressed with all of his, liberal ideas, and they let him know it. Dutch are so blunt, and they let him know it. And he's kind of like, what's going on with you people? And then he begins to recognize that they have a degree of satisfaction and security and stability that he is very impressed with. And that begins getting his wheels turning to sort of deconstruct the liberal theology. And that then is, what's often called neo-Calvinism, where he goes back into the reformational stance, but then updates it according to the liberal conversation at the end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century.
Well, these popular pietistic movements, both in America and Europe, have a tendency to become anti-intellectual, and Kuyper definitely seems to be trying to hold the center, keep the essentials of traditional Calvinist faith while maintaining its intellectual integrity.
Yep. That's exactly what they try to do. And that is, so he establishes a labor union, a newspaper, and also the free university. Now, when we hear free university, we think, what, they don't charge tuition? No, they're free of state church, state control, and And then up until really the 1970s, the Christian Reformed Church is always looking back to the Netherlands. They're always getting their cues from the Netherlands. And the Free University is like, if you do well at Calvin College, you can get a scholarship to the Free University. That's at the top of the hierarchy up into the 1970s. By the 1980s, things start to change, and they're much more part of the American systems. Then you want to go to Harvard or Yale.
What's the CRC view of the Free University today, if it still exists?
Liberal.
Right. I would assume almost everything in the Netherlands is considered liberal.
So what happens in the 70s in the CRC and in the Netherlands is the questions of women's ordination, what today we would call LGBTQ issues, and the Dutch state church goes liberal on both of those. And all that old DNA from the Afscheiding sort of and the Doleantie, which was Abraham Kuyper's movement, gets triggered, and suddenly there's this reaction in the CRC, like, we can't trust mom. We can't trust the Netherlands anymore. And so I grow up hearing Dutch immigrants. There are a few in America, many more in the Netherlands. America didn't let in many Dutch immigrants after the war, but Canada let in a good number. And then you would just hear people with Dutch accents saying, just shaking their heads about what's happened in the Netherlands in the 1970s. It's gone liberal. The churches are bad. And so we need to maintain the standard and the light here. And that's where the CRC stops looking back to the old country. And then in some ways probably begins this adjustment of looking for allies in America.
Well, and they started out trying to fit into the established colonial, the established Dutch community that had been dated all the way back to New Amsterdam, right? The colonial period.
Yeah.
And they formed the RCA, what became the RCA.
Yeah.
Reformed Church of America.
Church in America. If you say of America, someone in the RCA will say it's in America.
Okay. Definitely have to remember that. And they found themselves they found themselves once again on the outside when they come over. In the 1840s, 1850s.
Yeah.
So then they formed the CRC, and you have an important man, Albertus van Raalte.
Well, he's before the CRC. He goes to Holland. He's sort of this particular wave of Dutch in America. So he's in Holland, Michigan. Reformed Church in America College, Hope College is in Holland. And the CRC breaks off in the suburbs of Holland, again, over lodge membership. The Reformed Church in America was permissive about lodge membership. Hymn singing.
Masons, right?
Dutch immigrants wanted to sing only psalms.
Right.
A whole bunch of those issues. A lot of the issues were cultural. And then the Christian Reformed Church started with a few split-offs, but then the immigrants that came over, here we have this denomination that they all speak Dutch. They conduct all of their business in Dutch. Of course, Dutch-speaking immigrants are going to come over and feel much more at home there.
Yeah, because, well, as I understand, is this psalm singing versus hymns, big issue.
Yep.
And what do you when did that change? When did you start singing hymns in the CRC?
This is so interesting. There's this guy named H.J. Kuyper who sort of arises older than my grandfather, sort of arises in the 20s and 30s. And he's both a conservative and an adapter. And so he created the banner. So he was one of these young generation born in America that on one hand really wanted to double down on the confessions, but in order to really double down on the confessions, you need to have the institutions in place. So he worked to sort of establish and codify Christian Reformed liturgy. And then what he did was he produced a hymnal, which, 70 years before, 50 years before, would have been scandalous. But he handpicked or adapted hymns in English that were seen to be okay doctrinally. So this is where your confessionalism, he sort of lifts the confessionalism while sliding in hymns. And he basically wins. And so then eventually the Psalter hymnal is created, which had the first part psalms and the second part hymns. But what happens over time is that people stop singing the psalms and they start singing the hymns, because in English, the hymns are better and the tunes are better. And so it's really a fight between sort of pietism and sort of the history. But the best way to sneak in innovation is to do it as a conservative. That's always the best way, because he's a conservative. That's when you sneak the innovation in. And that's exactly what H.J. Kuyper did in a number of ways. He transitioned the denominational magazine from Dutch to English. He brought in hymns. He pushed Christian schools, Christian education. And he and those like him were the dominant voice until the counterculture hits the CRC with the post-World War II generation.
Well, what percentage that second generation, how fluent are they in Dutch that they could read the banner?
Oh, very fluent in Dutch. The second generation's very fluent in Dutch, okay, because it's not until the First World War that they really start leaning into English, because during the First World War, anti-German sentiment is so hot. There's a Christian Reformed church in Iowa that's burned to the ground. And so it's during the First World War period that you start seeing American flags just festooned in Christian Reformed churches, because here you have this language these people looking German, speaking a language that sounds like German. They're Deutsch or they're Dutch. And so suddenly the CRC in America, everything starts switching to English.
Okay. But now you're to a point where you don't. What percentage of the Dutch contingent of the CRC are able to read or speak Dutch?
More in Canada. But my father, when he started Calvin Seminary in 1957, Dutch was a language requirement for the seminary.
So he's fluent.
So my father could speak Dutch pretty well. We had some Dutch immigrant neighbor ladies in Patterson, and they were approving of my father's Dutch, but they told my mother, "You have an English throat." She couldn't. And my father, a little bit, maybe a little autistic, maybe a little obsessive. When he was perfecting his Dutch, he took a lot of care to try and get all of these subtle Dutch. And he heard his parents speaking Dutch. So my grandmother was my Hiram's wife was Dutch, not Frisian. So she grew up speaking Dutch in the home. My grandfather grew up speaking Dutch, probably, and Frisian in the home, probably Frisian in the home and Dutch in the school.
Do you remember the story in your dad's book about how your grandmother and he began dating? That she wanted his father was a painter, or is this, and she wanted the painting, and he said, "Well, when are you going to give me a painting?" And he said, "Yeah,
when are you going to give me one of those pretty paintings?" That's what, she asked Saka, and Saka said, "Well, basically, when are you going to start dating my son?" She didn't care for him. Not that way. They were friends, but just friends. And he won her over. He won her over. It was a good thing. It was a good thing. It was a good marriage. It was a good marriage. Temperamentally, they were good for each other because she was a firecracker. She would.
Well, that leads me to that makes me wonder: is your dad then a product more of your mother's influence than your father's? In some ways, you can see it, what you describe about Hiram. You see in that pastoral, loving kind of nature he expresses, and it's at least recorded in the book. Um, that's there, but he takes some interesting turns that aren't very Dutch Calvinist over the course of his career. At least he admits to it in the book.
Well, he does because, but again, I think my father, I think, is most like my grandfather. My uncle, who was the youngest of the three, is most like my grandmother. And my aunt, who was in the middle, was a mixture of the two of them. My aunt was very clever, but it was my uncle who became something of a rebel. I wonder if my grandmother, if she had been raised in a different time and place, would have been more like my uncle and the path that he took. Now, my uncle he's not, he's not in the Christian Reformed Church. He left the Christian Reformed Church with his church when they left over women in office, but he's very evangelical now. He lives in Florida. He's a retired cop. He runs with Christian motorcycle things. So he got a motorcycle and he does, very evangelical, quite revivalistic, but temperamentally like my grandmother. My father, I would imagine, and again, I wish my father were alive today because I'd love to talk with him about these things that really I only sort of put together even after he was gone, because the rumblings in the Christian Reformed Church really started just in the early 20 teens, when I basically started thinking through a lot of this stuff. I doubt my father ever saw an African American, with the possible exception of Pullman porters, when he was a boy. Had zero understanding of African American culture or anything. And then he goes to Patterson and, is just beloved. I mean, that church in Patterson, there's nothing they wouldn't do for him. And I see that, and I understand that in a lot of ways, that's from his father. Although my father was a better preacher. My father was a better writer, so he got some of that stuff from his mother. Some of those sharp skills. It doesn't mean my grandfather was stupid. He was not stupid by any means. Again, I told Job, the last 4 books he ever read were the 2 volumes of Kuyper and Bavinck in Dutch. But my father knew how to love people and prioritized people. And so that's what basically led him to, as the civil rights movement begins, I mean, every February, he would have Black History Month quizzes at Northside, and, maybe someone else was doing it because he'd always win, because he knew he had read so much in terms of the civil rights, all the movement and the leaders and the history. So he was bookish and a student, but he also cared and loved people. And so that's why I think when he came to Patterson, he could learn from them everything he needed to know about how to love them.
There are many. Well, what's interesting about your dad is there's a chapter what he calls his VIPs. Do you remember that?
No, it's been years since I've looked at that book.
It's interesting because it's the group of people who he they're kind of many of the down and outers who ultimately come into the church and become converted, or well, his concept, I mean, to listen to him or to read his description of, inviting people to bring Jesus into their life, it sounds very Billy Grahamish. I mean, it's like he sounds very much of the time of the kind of Christianity I was exposed to, that I grew up in the 70s and 80s. Which when but then I look at the history of the church and I'm trying to make the connection, because he sounds very it's just part of that American evangelical revivalistically influenced sort of, invite Jesus into your heart, gets, this sort of, there's make he's, without it, because making a choice, I mean, that's what gets Hoeksema so ultimately in trouble in the 1920s. It's it's this idea that you have any volition in this process, that it's really that controversy. But anyway, with your dad, is that you're looking at me skeptically. Help me out here. What it's just that your dad, when you talk about inviting Jesus into your life, which he uses that kind of phrasing several times throughout the book with people, and there's lots of stories about heroin addicts, lots of stories about people with who die of HIV or early, who knows what. People are dying in their 30s for various reasons. Who knows, cirrhosis of liver or whatever. He served a population that was very much on the margins, and but he spends a lot of time in their stories in the book, and you see the love in it and that care, but I'm like trying to place it. In the history of the broader church. Because I'm like thinking, it's like I'm looking at the CRC, and it's like it's a religious. It's almost like a capsule for preservation of a certain form of Dutch Reformed faith. But your dad is off on a mission that's different. He's a church planter, I guess you'd say, and
you're exactly right. He's a church planter. So if you, in the early 20th century, the real anxiety in the Christian Reformed, one of the anxieties in the Christian Reformed Church is, when they come to America, is Methodism.
Right.
Well, what do you mean? What are they worried about? Methodism. They're worried about a bunch of the things that you're pointing to. They're worried about the Stone Campbell type people. They're worried about
the Baptists,
and the Choicers, and
then the Pentecostals.
If you look at CRC, if you look at the love of God controversy that happens in the CRC, where the CRC has to wrestle with the question, does God love everyone? That's a complicated question, especially if you're a highly Calvinist denomination, because you've got this double predestination and this reprobation. And so you've got some hardliners in the Christian Reformed Church that would want to say, no, God does not love everyone. Some people are born to be damned. And of course, you have, as you noted, in the 1920s, the Hoeksema. Here's a little tidbit for you. Tell you
Common grace. The controversy was over common grace.
My grandmother, my father's mother, her older sister, married Herman Hoeksema's son, Homer. And that older sister of my grandmother was considered sort of the saint of the family. But what had happened in that church was old Herman Hoeksema was a rock star in the CRC. He had 1,000-member church before mega churches were a thing. And he was a powerful preacher. And he was one of the guys during the First World War that said Christians should not put flags in their churches because, the priority of keeping God first. Let's not, Herman Huxtamo was not about Jesus and John Wayne at all. And so he was a rock star. And then he was instrumental in a seminary purge before that. But then he was caught up then in that fight over common grace. And
help people understand what common grace is.
For certain elements of Calvinist traditions, they really take this antithesis, which is good and bad, heaven and hell, elect and reprobate. They take that very strongly. And so basically what they would say is God, from the foundations of the world, has chosen who he's loved and chosen who he's hated, and the world just plays out that way. Okay, so then these people are, but then you have the problem of, well, why, and you can find it in the Bible, why does God send the sun and the rain on the just and the unjust? You have the weeds and the wheat problem. And so one of the adaptations was, well, there's this thing called common grace. God is so good and so benevolent that he, in fact, will extend his grace upon the earth that includes the reprobate, and even the reprobate receive God's common grace. And I'm probably not articulating this with sufficient theological precision, but Herman Huxtamo says no. And so he leaves the denomination, and the Protestant Reformed Church starts in West Michigan, which is still around to this day. But he is like the great man of the schism, and he's getting older, and this is the story, at least that I've heard. The church they're trying to figure out what to do with him, and they're considering putting him in a home for care. And so my great aunt is his daughter-in-law. And somewhere in that church, a rumor gets out, something to the effect that Marie, my grandmother's sister, wants to put Herman in a home, and they thought that the family should take care of him. And they ostracized her. And so my grandmother, looking up to her older sister, who has married into, sort of Reformed ministerial hierarchy, sees how the saint of a woman, her sister, is being treated. And so a lot of what happens in the CRC, there's the confession, and then there's the family. And the CRC has all of those tensions. My grandmother also had a brother who was an alcoholic. And so my grandmother, over her life, never liked alcohol. And I don't know if I ever saw alcohol in my grandparents' home, because she saw her brother struggle with alcohol. And so you have all these issues, but because the CRC is so close-knit, these are also family issues. And family issues are funny because on one hand, there's nobody that you can hate and treat as poorly as family. And on the other hand, there's nobody that you can not hate because they're family. And so these issues go through the Christian Reformed Church. And generally speaking, once these issues sort of get up to synod sort of blunts and punts. When these really hardline issues come to the CRC, synod, here's a question. Children who are never baptized because they die too young, or they die in the womb, or something like this. How are we to regard them? Of course, Roman Catholic theology says, well, they're in limbo. That's where the word comes from, limbo. It comes from Catholic theology. And so during the love of God controversy, another issue that kicks up is, are these children saved? Could they be saved if they've never been able to express some kind of profession of faith? And Synod says, how can we say they're damned? They've never done anything to deserve damnation. So the CRC is always sort of taking the edge off what could be potentially some really hard Calvinist edges. Just like you described with Kuyper, they don't want to give up sort of the heart of the radical sovereignty and power of God in their Calvinist tradition, but they also don't want to say inhumane things. And so you find those kinds of things in the CRC, and that really drives some people crazy within the CRC, like the hardline confessionalists, but they're still part of the family.
Why do the hardline confessionalists stick around when they have an option like the Protestant Reformed Church?
Well, a lot of hardline confessional. Well, Kuyper is the one who comes down. This split with the Protestant Reformed Church happens in the 20s.
And isn't Common Grace his
Common
convention?
Grace is a Kuyperian idea.
Yeah.
And so many of these conflicts, if you take a look at Abram Kuyper, he's urbane, but he believes in the antithesis. And so what happens in the Christian Reformed Church is that sort of both sides that war throughout the post-war period, they both footnote Kuyper, because Kuyper has all of these ideas in him. But
right.
the pietism that comes through the reveal, the warmth, then sort of can bond with sort of American forms of pietism. And so that's where, well, as long as someone in authority checks through or alters, we sang a Fanny Crosby song in church this last week, "To God Be the Glory," and Fanny Crosby in that hymn has, "And opens the life gate that all may go in." That's in the Fanny Crosby song. The Christian Reformed Church in the Psalter hymnal changes it, that little word, to "opens the life gate that we may go in." Because you can't say all.
But you got to keep the good music.
But you got to keep the good music because, and then, and what happens in Americanization is that, of course, once the Christian Reformed Church starts worshiping in English, well, now suddenly you're open to this amazing tradition of English hymnody. And then once, of course, you get into the 60s and 70s, you have the biblical Jesus movement music that's coming in. And then the Christian Reformed Church has the worship wars in the 80s. Do we just sing out of the Psalter hymnal, or do we start singing off the overhead with these songs that Jesus movement people are writing that are right there? We're singing the Psalms again, but we love them now because the hippies are writing them. So it's this long process of Americanization where elements that are sort of in the Dutch start to bond with elements that are in America. And so this is where, even back into the 20s, the Dutchmen come in and they look at old Princeton, that was called Old Princeton, and they look at the fundamentalists and they're like, yeah. And then you have the split in Princeton, and Westminster, Philadelphia is founded. Basically, a bunch of people from Old Princeton hive off and start Westminster Seminary, and there's one or two CRC people in that midst because they're bonding with the Presbyterians. But if you read the Westminster Presbyterian and you look at John Knox, the Dutch are always a little bit, they're too strict. It doesn't have the warmth that the Heidelberg Catechism has. And so the Dutch sort of hold some hard theological edges in a warmer, little bit more flexible package. And of course, the flexibility is a little bit chaotic because sometimes they flex and sometimes they draw a hard line, which sort of then lends to this sort of bouncing off, this sort of pinballing off the rails that the Christian Reformed Church will do. Here we're going to lose some people on the left. Here we're going to lose some people on the right. And the Christian Reformed Church just keeps looking for the mean by bouncing off the edges, because you get too hard line and Christian Reformed people are like, and you hear this in Synod 2023, this clip that I play of Rita What about my children? Because in the Christian Reformed Church, it's family. And that's part of the reason why when I get onto YouTube, people are saying like, well, you're not a real Calvinist. You're too nice. I'm not Presbyterian. I'm from the Dutch.
Right.
And they're trying to hold these tensions together. And so my father going to Patterson, it's so funny because when I was scanning a bunch of stuff that my mother, were sort of trying to clean out her house and get rid of stuff, I found this promotional material for the chapel. I'll send it to you. It's, yeah, on one hand, it can read very evangelical because they're sort of getting their cues from Billy Graham. They're looking at the evangelicals and they're like, the Dutch, if anything, are stealers and adapters because they're too small a nation. And so they've got the French and the British and the Germans, and then they become a sea power, and they're always just looking around for a better idea that they can take their own and work. The Netherlands, that tiny little country, is the second largest food exporter in the world after the United States. And when you look at the size of their land,
right,
how on earth can these Dutch farmers be so astoundingly productive? Well, you got the North Sea, you got the British, you got the Germans, you got the French. These are people that are used to surviving by looking around and looking for a good idea and trying it out. And that's what they're doing. But that also tends to speed the assimilation.
Well, let me back to your dad really quickly. There's a passage here. I just made a note by it that I said Ron Copperman moment. For those of you who are in the who are around my channel at all, you'll know what that means. This is what he writes. Once a year or so before we left, I had a chilling experience in my study as I was constructing a sermon within which was a section where I was doing some pointed wordsmithing about the nasty cleverness of the devil. I was seized with a sudden coldness in my shoulders and my neck, an attack of pins and needles radiating to the top of my head. I'm like thinking, oh my goodness, we're going to have a stroke or something. I had a strong sense of a sinister presence right behind me, not the sort of experience I'm given to having or care to repeat. I turned around, saw nothing, but said out loud, I'm not afraid of you. My sins are covered by the death of Christ, and I'm protected through his life. In the name of Jesus, get out of here. You have no power over me. The feeling vanished as quickly as it came. Do you remember that passage?
No. I started reading his book and it was like, I know this. And so I didn't read it very carefully. I have it all and I've got his Word files. I've got all this stuff. I should probably read it more carefully. I would like to at some point edit the book because it could use a good editing, shorten it up.
He would have benefited from an editor, definitely. He's a good writer, but all writers need editing. But he introduced a worship band.
Yeah, probably.
He was in regular communication and with Assemblies of God folk.
Yeah.
And that's probably because of the African American Black community that's present in Patterson. There is one section here where he talks about how he navigated a difficult moment when someone he very much respected said that the Lord has him, wants him to be baptized in the Holy Spirit, and he's translating in his mind what that means for him versus what that must mean for her. And so, but his nature was so oriented. He found a way to not break the relationship.
Yep. That's pure him.
And when women, is a woman, as I read it correctly, correct me if I'm wrong, it was a woman who took over his pulpit when he left Patterson.
Oh, was that Sheila? Oh, that would
Yes.
be interesting. Yeah. Well, Sheila, part of what
And
of
he's
course,
happy about it, by the way. I mean,
yeah,
he's happy about it from what I
yeah,
can tell.
yeah.
I mean, he's not happy he's leaving
No,
the
no,
church,
no.
but he's happy that she's taking over his
Yeah,
post.
I think he very much would, have for him to have an African American woman succeed him is a win. Um, part of what happens in Patterson is that you've got people coming to your church from, the diversity of African American churches in America. So you're going to have some kind of Pentecostals, you're going to have some non-Pentecostals, but very expressive Baptists. You're going to have some Roman Catholics. I mean, people look at African Americans as if they're a monolithic people. Far from the truth, partly because, even in the Old South, there's a lot down there. It's a big area of the world. And my father was really good at, you know, my father was really good at enfolding misfits who were struggling because, there were always plenty of large, successful Black churches in Patterson. Why would you go to little weird North Side? And in a sense, my father's gifting is his curse, and it's the same with me. Why would you go to little weird Living Stones when there are big, thoroughbred, African American, Midtown, there's all these churches on the menu. Why would you go to some weird little church? A mostly Black church with a white preacher, that, the music is awkward. There's a
It
lot
was
of,
pretty successful by today's standards for a neighborhood church. 30, at some point, he talks about a youth group of 30
yeah, but
kids
you're also looking at the peak of the baby boom.
when everyone's younger, anyways. The
Everyone's
demos.
younger anyway, and church is still status in America.
It's around 1980, 81, 82. I think this is
Yeah.
when he was this up.
So and then we had so part of what the church did every year was it had a day camp program. And what the day camp program was, my father would raise money from all the surrounding CRC churches to basically hire young people from the neighborhood who could do it to be camp counselors. And then each of them would have 8 or 10 or 15 kids in their little camp, and they'd have Bible stories, Bible lessons, and crafts in the morning. It'd be like basically vacation Bible school, but it was run by employing kids from the neighborhood. And so it's a really crafty thing because, the 70s, 80s, 70s, 80s. This is after they stopped with the swimmers. That's a whole nother story. But was a CRC program. When they'd hire their own kids from the neighborhood, you do some basic discipleship with those kids who are the counselors. And those kids would then teach Bible to the smaller children. But once you had those kids for the summer employing them, chances are good some of those kids are going to stick around all year and call this their church home. It's a really smart way to go about it. And that program runs to this day. And but it's also during the baby boom. And I mean, everything was different. The Patterson is a continually changing landscape. And today, Patterson is different from what it was in the 70s and the 60s.
Mm.
Because, part of what happens after the Second World War and after the First World War, in the First World War, immigration stops. Where is the northern industry going to get their labor? You still have Jim Crow in the South. You have the Great Migration, Isabel Wilkerson's great book, Warmth of Other Sons. Great book. That's in some ways the book of much of my life, because I read about the California migration and discovered, oh my goodness, that's in my church here. So you have this huge migration after the First World War of African Americans, and they discover racism can wear different skins. And so then, of course, we've got the civil rights movement in the 60s and 70s. And then really after I left the country in 90, but I left really, I was going back and I married in 88. So really by the 90s, African Americans are sort of moving back down south because it's better down south than it was when their parents and grandparents left. So,
Sure.
and you've got other immigrants moving into Patterson. Patterson has always been an immigrant community. That's why the Dutch landed there.
Is his church still standing? Still open?
Yeah. It's very small. It's yeah, I gotta
Looks
be careful.
like Living Stones in a sense.
It's sort of become a family church.
Hmm.
So I get the sense that I might be wrong. I just want to be careful about that.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. So one of the things about his story, I lost count how many times he brings up something getting broken into and being stolen. I'm thinking that church, boy, like father, like son. In your case, it's just bizarre vandalism that just takes place. But and he's losing organ speakers and
Bathroom fixtures,
exactly, which it's
Christmas toys given for the poor.
What's the impact on the family for a ministry like that? You grew up with, again, this may be too personal, and just pivot or just say let's talk about something else, if it's too much. But what's the impact on family growing up within a ministerial household of that nature, where he's sacrificing constantly, and no doubt there's. I'm trying to figure out how the heck he even keeps the lights on under these conditions, much less keeps the family fed.
It's something that he grew to regret, that he and it's not just ministerial, but it's common. You're a young man, especially in religion and ministerial vocations. You never went into it for the money. You love the joy of ministry. You love the joy of service. And he goes to a place like Patterson, which is never ending need.
He grew to regret.
He grew to regret that he had missed out on us when we were there.
Oh, I see. Thank you.
And he wished. And so later on in life, he really tried to prioritize that. But the truth you learn is that your kids are there for just a window, and then they're gone. So
you have you grew up with two sisters, and you're the only boy, right?
Yep.
I'm sorry you lost your sister. Your one of your sisters, Lori.
Yep, my younger sister. Yeah.
How many years has that been?
She died in November of 2018.
And was she out of the? You go into the ministry, so obviously this stuff. Either what's the deeper trauma? The person who can't break from it, or the one who does?
Well, here's that isn't quite so clean, because I did not want to go into the ministry. I did not want to do any of this. And I go to Calvin College, and first I have no idea what I'm going to do for a major. And then I try engineering, and I do math, because I can do all of these things competently. I mean, I'm smart enough that I could do fine with the hard sciences. And then I take a history course, and I thought, history is just way more fun. But at the same time, I'm very active in my local church. I'm leading Bible studies in the dorm. I'm a Christian, and I like Christianity. I like reading the Bible. I like talking theology. So then I decide I'm going to go to seminary, because I like theology and I don't know what else to do. So then I have to spend a 5th year at Calvin, because I needed 2 years of Greek to gain entry to seminary. So I start taking Greek in my 4th year at college. So I take 2 years of Greek. I've got a few other prerequisites, but then I've got some other things. So I got to take a philosophy course with Nick Waltersdorf and Rich Mao. I got to take some extra philosophy and some extra history because I had a little bit of extra time. And then I'm going to go to Fuller Seminary because that sounds cool, going to Pasadena. But then I meet this girl and it's like, shoot, if I go to Fuller, that ain't going to last. So I'm kind of torn between that. And then the John Algara, who's pastoring the other inner city church in Patterson, comes up to me at a softball game. I'm playing umpire for the women's softball league in North Jersey. And, or it might've been a softball game that I was playing in. I don't know what it was, but he comes up to me and says, I'm in charge of the Classical Student Aid Fund. And, we fund people with any shirt tail relation to this thing. You are about as this classist as anyone could imagine. If you go to Calvin Seminary, you're probably not going to have to pay any tuition. We'll fund you. And it's like, you got the girlfriend, you get the funding. It's like, all right, I'll go to Calvin. But I kind of wanted out because I wanted to see something of the world. I wanted to get out to California, and Fuller at that point was the hot seminary. They had the Signs and Wonders, and some of my friends were going to go out there and do a year. They're going to get their degree from Calvin, but at least do a year at Fuller to, have loose meads and, see some stuff. And so Kevin Adams did that. Mark von Heitzman did that. Friends of mine, but I stayed at Calvin. And then after my first year, my then fiance was like, you spend all your time studying, you have no time for us. And it's like, well, maybe I'll slow down the classes. So then I kind of went 2/3 time at seminary, and she wanted to do foreign missionaries. She wanted to do foreign mission service. So, so that's when I was like, I don't care to be a local church minister. It's not what I want to do. So foreign missionary, that sounds like fun. I've wanted to get out and go see the world. So foreign missions was a great way to do it.
That's interesting. So your wife was the driver for sending you to the Dominican Republic.
Yep.
It's funny. We finally got to hear your wife's voice on video recently when you produced a short.
Yeah.
She's actually directing. It's great to hear her voice. I don't know if I'd ever heard her voice before.
No.
So you go to the Dominican Republic right after seminary?
So seminary at that point, you do a summer assignment. I went to Columbia, Missouri for a home missions church. And then you do a year-long internship. And so I was going to do an internship in Brazil, but the missionary in Brazil, both his wife was being treated for cancer and some American treatment would have been good. And he was being interviewed at Calvin Seminary for an Old Testament position. So Brazil got scotched. And so Dominican Republic was this massive field. My wife wasn't happy about Brazil because she was a Spanish major. Oh, okay. And so she wanted to do Spanish. She had done short-term missionary work in Mexico. Her parents were missionaries in Nigeria in the 50s and 60s. And then her father, who was a Lutheran minister, he had to stop being a missionary because just the malaria was just too hard on him. So he moved back to the States. And of course, you never get rid of malaria. But then he was killed in the 70s in a car accident.
Did you guys all manage to avoid that problem? By then, were there appropriate vaccines? I don't know much about malaria. What do you do to avoid it these days? Malaria is a real big
deal in the Dominican Republic. When I went to Central America on a J-term thing, my 5th year at Calvin, we had to take some chloroquine, some malarial prophylactics to go to Central America, but we didn't really need any of that in the DR. At that point, dengue fever was you'd get dengue fever.
Okay.
You live in the DR, you get dengue fever at some point.
So but you ultimately spent 7 years?
Yeah, clockwise total, but you've got home services, and you got the DR is close, and you have air travel, so it's different from my wife's parents, who you take a ship to Africa with barrels of belongings.
Does
So
she
you can
have some
easily fly
interesting
back and forth.
stories?
Yeah, her first 6 years, she was adopted, but she was a child of missionary kids in Africa, as was her
Okay.
older brother. He remembers it better because he left when they were about 8, it would be. So he's got more memories from Africa than she does.
And then you guys had produced 5 children total? You have
Yeah,
5
we
children.
had 2/3. Our daughter was born just after our missionary service, and then 2 more here in California.
Okay. And then so you come back from the Dominican Republic. People are going to want to know a lot of details about your experiences in the Dominican Republic. But we've been at this now already an hour and a half, so we may have to do a follow-up, just a missionary story interview maybe.
Oh,
But
missionary stories. Oh, don't get old missionaries telling stories. They go on forever.
It it impressed your dad a little bit when there's a funny story he talks about when you guys are uh, at some kind of church equivalent of a church potluck, I guess, and he's eating, and you say you don't have to eat it all.
Yeah,
And
that's
he's
right.
all like saying, "I'm a Dutchman. I eat it all. I always go back for seconds." And you kept saying, you finally had to. So tell us about that story. Do you remember that story?
So basically, I was working with about a dozen churches and another 20. They called them Campo Blancos, white fields. They were so to be a church in the Christian Reformed Church of the Dominican Republic, you needed 10 baptized members, then you could be a church. So these are small groups. But if you didn't have 10 baptized members, you had a preacher, and you had just a little preaching station of sorts, and those were Campo Blanco. So I would go a lot of my Sundays. I would go out and visit these churches, and they'd often want me there for baptisms, ordinations, special occasions. It was very ceremonial to have me there because now you have to understand, Mark, that for someone raised when and where I was in terms of the civil rights movement, the role that these Haitian pastors wanted me to fulfill in the Dominican Republic was just offensive to me. And as a young, idealistic 20-something, because they want me on stage because I'm white and I'm North American. And what I'm doing, as opposed to all of the little religious groups in these areas, is I'm lending credibility to the pastor. This pastor must really be someone because he's part of a bigger thing, instead of like all these backwoods pastors out there. So I sit on stage, and through 3-4 hour services, and I'm going to be the I'm going to be the I'm the final act. I'm the finale of the whole production, to hear me in my Spanish preach to a group of people who only a third of them even understand Spanish, because they're all speaking Creole. I mean, it's just kind of crazy. And so when my parents come down just to visit, my mom, we've got kids at that point. So my mom's like, I'll stay home with kids. She's there for the grandchildren. My father's like, I want to see what's going on. So it's, come on, Dad, we'll go out and see some stuff. And so we go to these churches, and then when it's the big shindig for the church, so they've got dinner afterwards, food afterwards. During the whole service, you're just smelling this food cook on the fires outside. And these were very poor people, but as is often the case, poor people know how to do a lot with a little. And the food was good. So my father and I said, and we're the honored guests. So they borrow a table and a chair from the richest people in the village, and they put a tablecloth and they set us up there. And it's like, don't drink the water, Dad. Just eat the rice. And so we sit down and they give us these big, huge heaping piles of rice. And I had figured out, after doing it that, you eat a little bit to make sure that you show them this is delicious. I'm receiving this gift, thank you so much. But then I just can't eat another bite, and then I give them back the plate, and then the plate just gets handed down the line of the hierarchy and the kids eat. And so don't eat too much or other people aren't going to eat. My father doesn't know this. So he starts digging in. It's like, my father and I, big appetites. We can put away a lot.
Sure.
And it's like,
well, he's your height, right? He was your height?
Yeah, he's the
roughly?
same size as me.
Yeah.
Like, Dad, just eat a little bit and then act like you're full and, cut it off there. Well, why? It's delicious. Children are not going to eat everything you put in. We can eat more when we get home, but you're taking food. Oh, that he understood.
So in your time at Living Stones, what's changed? What did you go in trying to do, and what did you find yourself doing actually?
So I had 2 job offers, calls, as we say in the CRC. I had one to a second staff position in Chicago. Nice church, lovely church that was going well. Very much sort of a CRC, a good solid CRC church. You had GEMS, which is the girls group, Covenants, cadets, youth. They have Christian school. The whole Chicagoland has everything. It's the whole colony package in Chicagoland. And originally, this church had stumbled on some calling, and this church had years of internal conflict. And there was a in the Christian Reformed Church, if you're vacant, that's what they call it, if you don't have a pastor, sometimes you can get a retired person to come in and preach for you, just preach every Sunday, and you kind of do the work. He's a retired guy, so you can live in the parsonage, and he'll work for you until you find a minister, at least for 3, 6, or 9 months or a year or something. And a guy named Gene Bradford, who had known my father from the Patterson days. And so he was here, and this church in many ways had been built by Vanderjack, the first home missionary, and then by Earl Marlink, the guy that I said got married secretly at Calvin. And Earl was a tremendous evangelist. And he would, back in the 70s and 80s, he'd go door to door. And he brought many of the people in this church personally to Christ and into this church. And he had been gone for a while by that point. But Gene Bradford says to the council, "Oh, I know who you need here. You need Stan Vander Klay, because I saw what Stan Vander Klay did in Patterson, and he can do that here." And my father had been at Northside for quite a few years, and he had thoughts of having. He had been there his whole ministry and had thoughts of having maybe one other church experience. So he had been trying to work a succession plan to get someone to take over from him so that the church could survive him leaving after so long. And his initial succession plan failed, but he decided he would still entertain a call. And so this church started showing interest. And because of Gene Bradford, and my father's kind of like, "Boy, sounds like fun going to California. I've never really, that church sounds great." And my mother, who's of course the practical person, they had already bought a condominium in Massachusetts where they were going to retire. And, all of their kids were on the East Coast. And my mother's like, you can go to California by yourself, as far as I'm concerned. We got our grandkids over here. We got our life over here. We're 4 years away from retirement. We're fixing up our condo. Our whole life is over here, and you're going to drag us way over there. So eventually they took a church in upstate New York, which was, much more in keeping. But he said to the church, "Well, I guess I can't really consider it, but you might talk to my son." So, I had already had the Chicago call, but I sort of delayed them because I knew this church was interested. And like my father, it's like, California sounds interesting, and whereas the Chicago church was majority CRC, majority Dutch. It was a fine church, a lot of fine ministry going. I came out here and it was like I was doing the interviews, and it's like, this church is kind of a mess. They didn't think they were a mess then, but they really were kind of a mess. They clearly didn't know how to interview me, clearly didn't know what questions to ask. But in the interview process, there was one guy. He was a AA guy. His name was Neil Hand. Huge man. He was maybe not quite as tall as I am, but he was, 350 pounds. I'm sitting in this restaurant, and they have just little groups of people coming in at different times to talk to me, to sort of get to know the church. This guy comes bounding in. He's got this whole notebook, and he's so excited to meet me, and he wants to talk about the A's and the B's. Well, who are the A's and the B's? The A's, so he had come into this church. The A's are the people with CRC Dutch roots, and the B's are the people with no CRC Dutch roots, and he was a B. And he just found the CRC fascinating, and he was such an interesting guy. And he just bounded up to me, and it was like, he didn't say it, which was probably a good thing, but he sort of knew, you and I are going to be friends if you come here. And we were good friends, and I miss him so. And almost everything I learned about AA, I learned from him. But the church itself was sort of a mess, and I didn't realize how much of a mess. And so then I sort of, kept Chicago on the hook. I let Sacramento know that I was talking to Chicago. So if they're going to call me, I can only keep these guys waiting for so long, and I need a job at some point. So Sacramento heard the process, but then they had me on a duo, which was common, sort of the traditional CRC way to do it. So they have two different ministers, and we both come in, and we both do interviews, and we both preach, and then the congregation votes on it. That's sort of gone away now. And it wasn't unanimous by any means.
Was it more work in? I'm sorry to interrupt, but was it more work in the early years, or more work now?
For the church to find a pastor?
No, for you to pastor it. What's harder, being a pastor of what you call a dying church, or a church certainly struggling, or versus one that is able to at least pay its bills?
The church was one of the things I learned immediately was that this church had had 30, probably almost its entire life, just terrible conflict within the church. And so right away, I'm finding myself seeing, oh my goodness, there are factions in this church, and they've been warring forever, and I've just landed in the middle of this. And then within 9 months, not only I started out sort of being the centerpiece of one of the factions who had won the vote, and discovering that key elements of that faction are now furious with me because nobody told me what I was supposed to do, which was support the agenda of that faction. And I had a council, and I supported the agenda of the council. So then we had a little church fight, and then but the church was larger, and so much more of my time, and even then I was just getting started doing this kind of work. So I had to sort of relearn sermon craft. And the church right away, along with every other church in this class, has sent us to Willow Creek. And so the idea was, you need to go to Willow Creek, get up to speed on North American missiology, and make that church grow. So I'm a dutiful person. So I go to Willow Creek, and I learn, the 7 steps, and I learn all of the seeker stuff, and I come back here, and well, let's start to implement. Well, what I didn't understand was that the faction that had brought me out there was not about to implement anything like that. And then it's like, but the rest of the church is like, what do we have to lose? Let's try it. So then we lose some of our members and a whole lot of money.
Try it. Maybe just tell me what that means.
That means, suddenly we have a worship band. And
And
I
this
didn't
is in
really
what,
change my
90, what year are we talking about?
97,
Okay.
97, 98. So then we have a worship band. And then we, it really, and then in 98, we start small groups, because first we sort of start with the seeker thing, but it's like very quickly you look around here and it's like, this is no seeker church. And one of our sister churches up in Granite Springs, they were working the seeker thing and getting success. We're just an oddball group of people here. And so the seeker thing wasn't going to work. And I figured that out pretty quickly. But then it was like, well, let's do the cell church model. So then suddenly we're going to start 4 new small groups. And then, see, basically, as I was starting new church ideas, we were planting churches with each successive strategy. So Granite Springs used the seeker methodology. Tim Blackman and Chuck Dillinger used the cell church methodology. And Ron Vanderwell used the hybrid methodology, sort of between seeker and cell. And so I was trying all of these here to the degree that I could. And every time we tried something and failed, I learned. But along the way, I'm continuing to, but right away, it was very clear that a lot of the ministry here was in some ways similar to my father's ministry. And the people here at church were first nervous because what am I going to do with these people from group homes and the homeless and the mentally ill? And it's like, well, that I know how to do. That's easy in a sense, because that's just Patterson, and I know that.
So was your part of what Living Stones is of Sacramento, had it probably already been impacted by crack in the 80s, right?
Yeah. So this neighborhood, so part of a difference between the East Coast and the West Coast, especially someplace like Sacramento, which has land around it, is that the city grows like tree rings. It just keeps growing out. And so this neighborhood was developed in the late 50s and 60s when redlining was ended. And so because Sacramento is the state capital, and because California is fairly progressive, a lot of African Americans work for the state. And so this church was filled with state workers. And part of why a CRC started then was in the 1950s and early 60s, California was also starting to dig into its water flood prevention reclamation projects. And so they're hiring a ton of water engineers. And guess who are some of the world's best water engineers? So it's filling up with Dutch engineers. But then this church should have been planted on the northeast side of the city, where most of those water engineers would have lived. But the first home missionary comes here and starts finding that the African Americans, who are now middle class, with aspirations and with education, aren't necessarily being enfolded into the historical Black churches. And so they're actually looking for something that's an alternative. And this church was an alternative. The services are only an hour long. It's interracial. It's self-consciously about racial reconciliation. And so in that way, it's very similar to Northside, except in California, it's not just African Americans and white folks. It's Japanese, Chinese, Vietnamese, Hmong, Pacific Island peoples. The patchwork in Sacramento was just so much fuller. Hispanic. Patterson, it was black and white. Here it was everything. And this church, by successive different ministers who had different emphases, one of the emphases of a previous minister was friendship ministry, which is ministry to the disabled and families of the disabled. So the church had a lot of that. And so it was a astoundingly diverse, small congregation, but it was bigger when I got here because we still had a fair number of the Dutch. And so then when we had that early split, the church finally wasn't at war with itself anymore, then we began to grow from the neighborhood. But the neighborhood was filled with people of the same age of the founders of the church. And so I was adding 60, 70, 80, 90-year-olds.
Right.
And so the church was going well, but we weren't changing the demographic curve because the neighborhood demographic was set.
Mm. Boy, that leads me to a whole bunch more questions about many things, but I don't know how much time you've got left, but it's just tap
I'm
out.
good for now. We can go a little while if you want
All
to.
right, tap out when you need to.
Right.
We'll just push because we could talk about church growth. I mean, so if they had done the other location, you said the northeast of town.
Yeah. So there's
if they'd gone there, you
church.
might have been pastor of the Sacramento version of Cross Point or something.
Yes. Except that Cross Point is a much deep. Cross Point is.
That's for people. That's Van Donk's church in
Right.
Chino. It's big. It's successful. It's probably about 1,500 people.
I don't think they're that big anymore. So what happened? So I mentioned already, it's the dream of every immigrant to own a dairy. And so what happens is the two places that people went after the Second World War was Canada and California for the Dutch immigrants. And so some of those Dutchmen went to Southern California, and they started dairies in just the suburbs of Los Angeles, like Artesia. And they started their dairies there. But what is Los Angeles doing during those years? Very quickly, the dairymen figured cows are just kind of a way to keep feeding the family. Our real business is land development.
Real estate.
And so those dairymen just kept moving out. And so by the time they're in Ontario, Chino, they've already been through one or two cycles of selling their land to developers. And then, of course, that's exactly what they did in Ontario, Chino. And then they moved to places like Visalia. Some moved back to the Midwest. Some tried in Bakersfield. But that's a much bigger colony. Sacramento was always sort of what happens in the Christian Reformed Church after the Second World War is you have this baby boom, and the Christian Reformed Church, which is very upwardly mobile through education. They're Dutch. This is what they do. So they try to give their kids the best education possible, get them the best jobs they can, make the most money they can. So the Christian Reformed Church just financially does very, very well. And so then after the war, like in the 1950s, the church planter here, I mean, Ripon is the center because the Dutchmen settled in Ripon because land was cheap. And then they start with dairies, but then some of them figured out, you can get milk from cows, but you know what else you can get milk from? Nuts. And the nice thing about nuts, you got to milk those doggone cows every day. The nuts, they just grow on their own. So in Ripon, the dairy farmers became almond farmers.
Okay.
But the
almond?
Children...
Almond?
They say almonds because to get them off the tree, they knock the L out of them. So when they're on the tree, they're almonds. When they're off the tree, they're almonds.
Gotcha. Okay.
So
for us peasants,
for you peasants,
civilians,
for you, the uninitiated. So, but what's happening, of course, is that not everybody can be a dairyman. That's sort of the way farms work. Mm-hmm. So what are you going to do with your other sons and daughters during the baby boom? No, you're going to get a college education. And you're going to go out and you're going to compete in the world, and you're going to become rocket scientists. And plus, Sacramento's a military town, so you've got military people coming through. So a church starts here, and it's full of, like, one of the farmers. He's a rice farmer. His father was a truck driver in Southern California. You've got water engineers. You've got rocket scientists. You've got people with PhDs. And you've got these crazy home missionaries that are enfolding African-American and Chinese from the neighborhood using basically evangelical songs and methods to save their souls for Jesus. And you've got African-Americans that are looking for an alternative to the Black church. And that becomes this church. But the whole missionary originally went through the phone book in Sacramento and called everyone with a Dutch last name.
Right.
Because why go door to door? Just stick to the Dutch. That's where you're going to get your response. And so that's how they did it. And the first Dutch non-nucleus start was in Fairfield, not too far from here, where
But
they stayed.
that drive, that cultural drive for success, and ambition for status and success and security, because as you said, there's a lot of generational trauma. And you think about it, it goes all the way back to Napoleon. It's a period of, the last 200 years has not been easy.
Right. And the Netherlands has long been a refugee place. They're on the fringe of the big places in Europe. And so if you're a misfit, you go to the Netherlands. It's part of the reason they developed a culture that's so flexible.
Mm.
That's why the Anabaptists went to the Netherlands. It's why the Pilgrims went to the Netherlands.
Right.
So IAN for CLE goes to the Netherlands.
Yes, that's true. And that's another stuff. Anyway, but this ambition, drive, the drive for security, to me, it seems like a drive for security above all else. Yep. Everything else is in service of that. Yep. So, but that seems to be, this goes into Swearinga's article about the burn the shoes and all of that. What's pulling the community apart is that drive for success and status.
It works both ways.
Right. It can fuel it if you can hold them, if you can keep them all in, keep them all showing up for church, or for at least for Christmas and Easter.
Or building Christian schools.
That's true. And that may be that's as you've talked about before. That could be the thing that kind of gets you through this rough patch, would be the Christian schools, which are thriving, versus the churches that aren't.
Right.
Denominationally speaking. So how many, when you look at, we can talk about your family, your extended family, or we can just talk about what you observe in communities, traditional CRC communities of people, families, generally speaking. But what percentage are holding with the faith, and how many? Any idea? How many are becoming nuns? How many are NONEs?
Yeah.
Yeah, you know what I mean. I guess I'm not asking this question very well, Paul, but
So I think it's really helpful to talk with you through this, because I know, you've been reading broadly in terms of church history to try to get a sense of, American evangelicalism and religion in America, because that's a really huge and important topic. So part of what you're right about, sort of pegging the Dutch and our ladder climbing, and especially, in our communities, to be Dutch means to be thrifty. You clean your plate. These are values from people who have starved in past generations. And so you're right that this ambition and thrift and drive is for these things. Well, what happens in, let's say, the post-World War II consensus is that this sort of takes on, we're following the trajectory in America. We're getting into the Ivy League, where we're getting into major corporations. We're excelling in all of these disciplines. And so we're sort of following the post-World War II consensus. But part of the denomination is, because a lot of the denomination is also out there in agricultural areas, and they tend to be bonding with red state values. Mm-hmm. So they're not going to university necessarily. They're becoming farmers. and landowners. And so they're riding a different trajectory up. And the Christian Reformed Church has always been a conservative denomination. This goes all the way back to the Netherlands and this conservatism and rural. And so what happens in the women in church office split is that the denomination is basically cut right down the middle, sort of between ascendant blue church religion and red religion. It's right down the middle. And so you have 20 years of votes that are just, within a few percentage points, one way or another on Synod. And in the end, we just agree to disagree. So you can have a local church option. But then over time, a majority of classes seat women. So women are seated at Synod. We hived off about 60,000 conservatives there. And so the progressives, not terribly progressive, but the progressives are like, we won. We own it. It's ours. We have been fighting the post-war consensus since from the 70s to the 90s, and we finally prevailed over the conservatives. They're still going to be here. That's fine. They can be here, but the conservatives are the ones that we are going to bring into our universities and transform them into blue state progressives. What they didn't recognize was that the children of the generation that won the war over women in church office were not going to church. And the urban churches in the CRC were dying and disappearing at an enormous rate. But the churches, many of the churches in the rural areas or the red state areas were not disappearing, they were growing. And so the balance in the denomination had shifted. So when we get into the 2020s, I talk about the circulatory system. Kids are no longer going to Calvin College. Conservative kids have long gone to Dort, or maybe to, Liberty or some other place or community college. But the children of the affluent and successful in the denomination, well, they'll go to Calvin if they're sort of second tier. But if they're really sharp, they'll go to Harvard or Yale or Princeton or Stanford they're mainlining, and they're not going to church. They're solid Democratic voters, but they're not going to church. And in Canada, the dynamics are different, but similar in that the ladder climbers are becoming the liberal elites in the country, but they're no longer sending their sons. They no longer would, when
they can't keep them. They can't keep them in them.
No,
but you used to say you can't keep.
How you can keep the kid down on the farm?
Right. And in this case, it's once you've sent them off to college, how do you keep them going to church?
Right.
But it doesn't even require college, because I think that the secularization pole is cultural at this point.
Yeah.
Because it's on the internet. You don't have to go to college anymore. It's on the internet.
No.
But on the other hand, here's a hard question. When you just look at your family, without naming names, and again, if it's too personal, just look at your own family, and you can reach this out to just imagine in your mind your extended family. When you think about which is harder on the family, the church, the experience of being a child of a minister or spouse of a minister, or being a Christian in a denomination that doesn't say jive well with the values you're learning in the broader culture. I guess what I'm asking is, what breaks these things apart? What for some reason you've got this cycle we talked about already with the in the CRC or Dutch Reformed movement there's this liberalization and this drift. It seems less intentional, and then a hard rightward turn towards a conservative pullback.
Yeah.
And you have these, it keeps liberalization drift and hard conservative reaction, and does it again and again. And at a personal level, that seems to have a toll on people's faith. But is that the problem, or is it something else? Because I know of a lot of I've known a lot of pastors' kids up close, and their their faith is more often put in jeopardy by the experience of being a pastor's kid than it is by Christopher Hitchens or something.
Yeah. In my case, I think my parents were such attractive Christians that even though obviously my father worked really hard in Patterson, there was no duplicity, there was no hypocrisy. They lived what they believed, and it was inspiring. It was honest. It was sincere. It was loving. Um, I think my older sister probably has a little bit more bitterness about some of those things than I do. I think she felt it in different ways than I did. My younger sister didn't feel that way at all. Um, she sort of continued the legacy in many ways. I think that there are a lot of elements. One of the big themes of my channel is to try to continue to work through this de-churching and deconstruction and all of these issues. I think for some CRC people, especially boomers older than me, they look back at their upbringing and there's some nostalgia because the Christian schools were full and we knew everyone. We were part of a tribe. It was awesome. But it was, all these Sabbath rules, we were so narrow-minded because we thought if someone married someone outside the faith, they would be going to hell. And we don't believe that anymore. And so then, especially women in church office and then same-sex marriage, hey, we've got kids and grandkids who are gay. This is a family thing. These are our family. Why would we not affirm and bless them and have them be part of us? And yeah, I totally get that. But you've got this other side. And so also part of what happened in the Christian Reformed Church is its posture towards the rest of America was, we think we've got something great with our Reformed theology. We would love to, in the 80s and 90s, it would be language like we speak Christianity with a certain accent. And so we'd like people to be able to adopt our accent. And part of what the CRC didn't see coming was the Young, Restless, and Reformed movement, part of the emerging church movement, where people were suddenly very excited about Reformed theology, but often Presbyterian, more hard-lined Reformed theology. And then a small percentage of them, they may be chafing under some of this hard-linism. They discover the CRC, and it's like, this place is organized, it's wealthy, it's welcoming, they're flexible. What's not to love about this? And so while many people could sort of take the Christian Reformed Church for granted, like you take family for granted, when I move away, I'm not going to go to church, but I can always come home and, visit my old friends at the CRC. What was coming in were people who were refugees from all kinds of things saying, no, we're serious about this theology. We're serious about this home, and we're serious about church discipline. And I mean, part of the truth was the Reformed Church in America, when for polity reasons discovered they couldn't do any disciplining of the classes on the East Coast that were ordaining LGBT persons to office, et cetera, they lost 60% of their membership and 50% of their churches. within a couple of years, so that the RCA is maybe 75,000 people now. And, the church has been gutted. And by virtue of the off-skiting polity of the Christian Reformed Church, it was just a majority vote. It was 70-30. No, we'd like to keep our position the way it is. We don't want to split, but we'd like to keep the position the way it is, and we're ready to enforce it. And so now we're getting the splitting off that we have now. But the truth is that a lot of the older generation, so when you look at a lot of the churches that are leaving, they're older churches. And in some ways, what they've been saying is, we'll do affirming. We just want to keep the light on for our kids and grandkids, hoping that we'll have a place for them to come back to. And other people are looking at them, they're not coming back. I don't care how much you can affirm. They'll celebrate that you're open, but they don't really care for your church. They're climbing other ladders. And so, it's institutional survival at a really high price. And just in terms of it's clear to me, a couple of things are clear. Number one, the Christian Reformed Church, despite the fact that it's a Calvinist denomination that believes that we are radically called and chosen by God, spent enormous amounts of money and energy to try to make sure their children were elect. We built all these institutions. I mean, we're only saved by God's grace, but doggone it, we sure are going to put our kids right in his sights. We're going to work really hard to make sure our kids are elect. In many ways, if you're looking not necessarily at election, but in terms of church participation, Christian school and Christian college is no guarantee your child, when they're done with college, will think that Christian church participation is absolutely important and valuable and essential for my welfare and future. They find all of the standard American secular things, a good job, a good education, the right spouse, all of those things they find far more essential to their well-being than that. And so this is where, again, broader Christian history, you tend to see more of this cycle of, were your parents loving? Was your family chaotic? No. Were your parents loving? Yes. Did they always feed you and clothe you? Yes. You take all those things for granted. And then the institutional underpinnings, second and third generation, kind of get lost. Then you have other people where life was chaos. And then they see the Christian Reformed Church and it's like, that's orderly. They have rules and they follow them and they care about them and they share with each other and they do that. I want that. And so then you look at people like Phlebas, a younger generation, Canadian raised CRC. And now I hear a lot of voices of millennials and younger who say, I want what my parents and grandparents threw away. I want the institutions. I want the rigor. I want the discipline. I want all of that because the world is just too chaotic.
That's that conservative impulse.
Yep.
That recycles but how do they keep their kids and grandkids?
Right.
It's just.
And Wesley made that point, it's the, faith produces prosperity. And prosperity produces unbelief. To shorten it up.
True. This seems like as good a place as any to end it. This is one of those interviews you could just keep going. I know there's tons of stuff I wanted to get through and didn't, and I'm going to get criticism for not asking the right questions. But
Well, and I'm a bad interviewee because I talk too much, and you're too
No, not at
polite. You
all.
have to interrupt me more.
Well, it's an easy interview, right? Yeah, well, I guess what I would close with is where do you, well, the one question I was going to ask that I really was when you brought up Fuller is where would Paul Vander Klay be had he gone to Fuller? Would because that would that one move decision to go to Calvin Seminary as opposed to Fuller probably is what kept you in the CRC.
Probably, probably. I imagine I probably would have gone to Fuller. Who knows what I would have done? Who I would have met? Who I would have married? Where that would have led me? I likely I wouldn't be surprised if I would have at this point maybe been Presbyterian. PCUSA mainline. That certainly was much more my trajectory in a lot of ways.
Or spun
Um,
off into a vineyard type of thing. Your dad wrote. I mean, there's healings in your dad's book. Ron
oh yeah,
Copperman's going to love your dad's book.
yeah,
You're going to
yeah,
have
yeah,
to send
yeah.
him the link.
And my father always believed that um, there's a real sweet um, there's a real sweet connection between Reformed theology and Pentecostal practice.
Hmm.
John Wimber was basically Presbyterian until everything happened that happened, and the Vineyard is basically charismatic Presbyterians in some ways. At least that's how they started. So no, my father was very at home with divine healing and that John Wimber wrote these books, Power, it was Power Evangelism and Power, forget the second one.
I can't remember either.
But yeah, my father was very at home in that. And part of that was, again, just part of he spent most of his ministry context in an African American setting. And so, Azusa Street, I was just reading Spellbound, Molly Worthen's book, and she touches on Azusa Street. What happened in LA with Azusa Street was at least as much about race as it was about the miraculous. So, it shouldn't be a surprise that you might also say, where would Paul Vander Klay be if my father had gone to Northern Alberta? We have all these sliding doors in our life that take us to different places. And to me, this just, a lot of people would say, oh, this isn't, to me, that just speaks of God's providence, because I am who I am because of, if I wouldn't be alive if my great great grandfather hadn't decided to uproot and go to Michigan. Probably. I mean, you don't do something like that. He was a character. I found his obituary from the paper in Spring Lake, Michigan, and you could just tell he died at like 94. And you could just tell by the obituary that he was a character. And he leaves the Jewish community, goes to be among the Dutch, and his kids become Dutch. Changes, his grandchildren, Springhouse Court yard burns down. All of the kids lose the Jewish names and take on anglicized Dutch names. So, yeah, it's hard to know. It's hard to know where God leads us. But that's, to me, Hendrik de Kock had this great saying, follow that lamb wherever he goes. And you've heard me say it. And it's I think, what's at the heart of Christianity is a very mobile religion. It isn't anchored, especially Protestantism. It isn't anchored in Mecca or Jerusalem. It travels.
But there are people who are always trying to anchor it somewhere.
Yeah,
and
well,
that's the battle, right? It's who owns the anchor.
Well, it's
and
like,
where do we place it?
To me, it's like a kite. A kite can only fly if it's tethered to the ground. You need both. And so you need a foundation. And I think that's, thinking about my father and my parents, I mean, that's what they gave me. They gave me a foundation. And that foundation became very important and continues to be important. I don't think I would be who I am or do what I do without the foundation they gave me. A lot of people scratch their heads. It's like, Calvinism? Because I seem too nice, too open, too willing to talk about too many other things and be friends with too many other people to be a Calvinist because of what they think Calvinists are. But to me, it works and fits.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's when I listen to Redeemed Zoomer talk about uh, a, a reformed Reconquista of he likes buildings. He wants to, he thinks infrastructure is the secret sauce. I'm like, look, and I'm looking at the history of the Reform movement, Calvinism specifically in the United States, and it really has a hard time holding itself together over the generations.
Yeah.
And it's probably too big of a question now, but at this stage of the interview, but I wonder, what is that? Why is that? And is there a remedy for it, or is it just a feature of the system?
Calvin is a synthesizer. He's a second generation reformer. Mm-hmm. He looks at more than people recognize often. He looks at church fathers. He looks at Luther. He, of course, was raised Catholic, French Catholic. Mm-hmm. And he's an applier. And so Geneva fills up with these French refugees, and he tries his best to go from a 2-speed where you have monks and saints and monasteries and, the church trying to deal with the masses outside the walls and the secular churches. That's, of course, where the word comes from, the secular priests and the secular churches. And he tries to, in some ways, he's apocalyptic in some ways. He tries to bring the kingdom of God down onto the earth in Geneva. And you see this impulse again and again. And you're right that this world, and I think a close reading of the Gospels bears this out, this world can't hold all that the kingdom of heaven wishes to give us. You see that in, International House of Prayer or Bethel. You look at these high intensity Pentecostal ministries. Bill Johnson, in that sense, is sort of a Calvinist, because it's like, we're going to be really serious about signs and wonders here. We're going to really heal. And almost every time you really go after it, it sort of spins out of your hand. It's sort of like something that you can't, it's too much for human hands to, and we want to take it and root it. And so Calvinism keeps spinning off in these crazy ways, but at the same time, it's a seed bed for so many other things. And I think part of what the Dutch tried to do is just understand that, well, it's kind of like a hot potato. You don't want to grab it or you burn your hands. So you try to hold it loosely and not lose it. So you're going to need flexibility, because this world can't hold all of the kingdom of God that God wants to give us, which is why there's a new heaven and a new earth that's coming, which will hold more. And so I think, Calvinists are in many ways pragmatists, because we want to have as much of the kingdom as God wants to give us. And part of the interesting, let's say, relationship between Calvinism and Pentecostalism, and I guess I would say, true charismatic giftings, is the minute you try to engineer a gift from above, you've committed idolatry.
It looks like witchcraft.
Yes, yeah. Exactly.
Yeah.
And so Calvinism basically says we have our hands open. That's all we can do. We can't reach up and pull God down.
Mm.
The best we can do is have our hands open. And for the Pentecostal, it's exactly the same. We want the healing, we want the deliverance, we want the, we need you to descend upon us from above. And there's nothing we can do to prime the pump. So we're completely dependent on you, Lord. And so what we're going to do is we're going to pray, because that's all we can do. We're going to pray, and we're going to wait, and we're going to beg you to shower your blessings upon us, to restore us, to renew us, to save us. So you can see the connection between a Calvinism that says, not what my hands have done can save this guilty soul, and a group that says, we are in need of a fresh outbreak of your Spirit, Lord, or we're going to die of thirst. It's the same impulse.
Yeah. Very good. Let's land the plane.
All right, we'll land the plane.
Is there a question I should have asked you?
No, this is fine. I mean, the problem is, again, I'm a talker, and I couldn't. The same problem my father's book has. And my sister tried to whittle some things down, but that started a wrestling match with him, and she's like, I'm not going to fight you, Dad. This is your story. This is your book. Make it as fat as you want.
Yeah. It's I haven't really explored it enough yet, but I'm also fascinated by what attracts people to faith, and why some people seem to live perfectly fine without it.
Yeah.
I don't quite. I mean, I think maybe neurologists think they have a better grasp of that question than or answer to that question than I do. But I'm not sure if that's entirely the answer. But just some people are wired for it. Yeah, that's one of the big questions I want to pursue someday, because some people just don't seem to need it.
Yeah.
And there are others of us who seem like we're lost without it.
Yeah. Blessed are those who are lost without it, for it will be given.
There you go.
There's a beatitude for you.
All right, let's end the recording.